Hello, in this video we're going to look at strings and loops in a little more detail, and we're going to look at a specific approach called reading frames. So what that is how do I take a string that exists and look at specific sections and pull that out and make some sort of analysis. Often where we'll see this is when we have a string and we want to see if it contains a word, in which case we'll access a portion of it using the substring method. So if we think of a reading frame, essentially it looks like this. If I'm looking for the word cat, let's say, I'm going to need to look for three letters. So I'm going to look ACA, and the question is that cat? No. Then I move it along. Is that cat? Yes. No, 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 no. What we can see is that blue line represents our reading frame. We're going to imagine that we pull out those three characters and inspect if it's the word cat or not. Now, what often happens when we do this is we end up with this situation, and you'll see the problem. We keep moving that reading frame to here, and notice it's become red now. The reason why it's red is because I can't pull out three characters here, right? If I set my reading frame starting at index 8, there's only 2 characters to pull, and likewise, if I set my reading frame starting at 9, there's only 1 character to pull. So, like I said, what's the problem with the last 2 reading frames? So assuming we are using substring to pull out the reading frame for inspection, the last 2 pulls would need to be, and this is assuming that the string is stored in variable s.substring 8, 11 and s.substring 9, 12. Both of those are going to generate an index out of bounds error because if you try and access a string of length 10, they don't have indexes in those locations. Sorry, they don't have values in those indexes. So what we want is this behavior. We want to move along it like so, and then when we get here, we want to stop. And so to simulate this, we actually imagine using a loop, and a loop is somehow going to walk through and do this a number of times. And then we're going to exit the loop. Now we said that we often use substring to pull out a selection of characters. I want to be clear that you might do this to do a number of things, and you really have to think about the context of what you're doing. But in our case, let's imagine that we're going to use substring to access the word, the reading frame, and inspect it for something. So for example, like in our last slide, we said we want to count the number of times cat appears in this string. So the first reading frame, we could access it using substring and passing it 0, 3. Pass 1, 4 to substring. 2, 5. Remember that substring is inclusive, exclusive. So 2, 5 means that I'm going to include index 2, 3, 4, but I won't include index 5. Remember, a nice thing to keep in mind with substring is that if you take the second argument minus the first argument, you'll get the length of the generated string. And so we move across like this. Now this is where I want to stop, and so I terminate my loop. So look at the list of indices on the right here. So what we want to see if we can find a pattern in this. And again, this is why it's so important when you're trying to work through problems like this. You set this up and then you do a specific case and try and find a pattern to what's happening. And notice the first argument increases by 1 each time, and the second argument is always 3 larger than the first. Again, conveniently, the length of the word cat. You'll see pretty quickly that if I'm looking for a word that's 4 letters long, the difference will be 4. 5 letters long, the difference will be 5. So what I can do is I can use a for loop to count from 0 to 7, and then just offset the second parameter by 3. So I can actually, if I have my loop and a counter I can have an I count from 0 to 7, and then every time pass the substring I and I plus 3. And we'll get something that looks like this. So my question for you now is, in setting up the loop, what is going to be my count, my check, and my change? Well, we see if this first parameter or first argument is what defines our loop, it's going to start at 0 and end at 7. So I is going to be set to 0. I will be less than 8, or we could put less than or equal to 7. And each time I increases by 1. So this code here will search through this string and access those reading frames and then count the number of times that that specific word cat appears. And right there we have our string S, our temporary string. We set up our loop. and then we assign t, our temporary string, s.substring, and we use that loop counter to pull out the correct reading frame. And then we check if t is equal to the word cat, and then if so, we add 1 to our counter. Note I haven't actually declared the counter in here. So now my question is, what's considered poor form about the above code? I'm going to tell you it's going to work perfectly fine with the exception of not declaring the counter variable. But what's considered poor form here is this. We should never actually write in the length of the word. We should always have the length of the word calculated using the built-in length method, because that means that it will calculate the length at runtime, and this will work for a string of any length. If I was to put I is less than 8 here, this is only going to work for strings that are length of 10. So this idea of using a loop to walk across a string and inspect part of it is really, really important. And one of the trickiest parts is figuring out what to set the values in your loop to. Watch for those index out of bounds there. Those are going to be a clue that you probably have a problem with how your loop is set up. So why do we need to know this? Again, if you take a look at this, what you see here on the right-hand side of the screen is actually this is the genome for E. coli. And notice it's just a bunch of nucleotides. So inside there are some instructions about protein construction. And by searching the sequence and identifying patterns, we can find these proteins. It's actually quite complicated, but this can be done using loops and strings. And in fact, we actually look at strings of length 3 to look for very specific, what are called codons, and those codons then map to specific amino acids. Anyways, I won't dive into that. So strings and loops might be really useful here. So again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to post on my channel or ask me directly. And specifically with this loops and strings, a really good place to go and practice is coding BAT, specifically strings too. Hope this video helped.